I'd like you to read this poem, friend. For the life we all know is close to an end. What of it? I know it drives you around the bend. Wake up, sweat your brow, and back to bed. You've ambitions, but there's so little room in your head. Be productive, they say. Be a machine, pull your weight. And by the time you're allowed to enjoy life, it's just a little tad too late. And if you don't toil, you're left in the dust. Those institutions you rely on for support will try to cut you off and cut you short. Creativity and freedom are of no interest for the establishment. The people? They're under arrest. Law and order is what they drill into your head, watching your every move every single day. They spout liberty, democracy, then tell you to obey. What about the world around you? It's on fire, sometimes literally. Everything is dying. People too, recently. This earth might not be habitable for long. That's if this paradigm is to live on. And who's responsible for all this anyway? It's not your neighbour, that's for sure. Or the poster who brings parcels to your door. Or the carer, or the nurse, the farmer, the fireman, not even your local barista. Not even the brothers and sisters from afar who we welcome into our countries. Maybe it's just us. You can stop that tripe. Humans have lived in harmony before. We did relatively alright. It's not our nature to be a blight. No. It's not that hard to see her as the onus in part. Those with a big head but a meagre heart. Earth and humanity aren't what they adore, for the pursuit of profit lie at their core, and they entice the powerful to fully ensure that the people don't come banging at their door. But why obsess over profit, wealth, power, control? The answer is that material conditions lie at the core, a conflict of interest between the rich and the poor, brought by the systems, the paradigm we all endure. We all want a piece of the pie, but the wealthy want more. I think they fear themselves becoming poor, no matter how irrational that might be. Now, friend, don't read this poem in despair. Lift your head from your hands and get up from your chair. There's a light in this tunnel, and we can get there. Times have been tough. Yeah, that's fair. But this crisis ain't above us, despite it getting in our hair. So, what do we do? How do we bring about a better world? Well, we can't vote away our problems, that's for sure. We've tried it many times, it's never worked before. The political establishment's all bought and paid for. Your vote is but a hand wave, I can assure. So then, what? Well, politicians twiddle their thumbs. The billionaires won't help. They won't fix the world. We gotta fix it ourselves. And as we fix stuff, we'll do away with them as well. Quite frankly, both of them can go to hell. But there's sometimes things that slip past elite eyes. This system conveniently sells us the means of their demise, the means of micromanufacture, self-sufficiency, and so on. We'll raise awareness, there's a vision people can count on. There's a future out there which we can strive for. Freedom and free access, cooperation, ecology, community. A new paradigm worth fighting for. So, please, listen here. As we emerge from this crisis, as we emerge from the dark and cold, it's time for all of us to do something bold. To build a new world in the shell of the old. If there is one thing this last year has taught us, it's that society is never immune to shocks to the system, so to speak. As a rather bumpy late 2010s came to a close, many expected 2020 to be a blank slate, a new unspoiled page in history. However, little did we know what lay ahead of us. COVID-19, among other events that took centre stage last year, put a spanner in the works, to put it lightly. On one hand, many have unfortunately departed from this world. People have lost their jobs and livelihoods. People have been isolated from their friends and loved ones. And we've all had to get comfortable with the new and necessary measures to curtail the spread of the pathogen. Nevertheless, this crisis has exposed to us the true ills of our modes of economy and society. It has made people more conscious of the vapid inequality and corruption within our current system, and has even given us a glimpse at a world relatively free of pollution, as seen in the first round of lockdowns. Crucially though, it has reignited people's willingness to engage in community support and mutual aid in times of struggle unprecedented in this century. What is clear though, as most starkly seen in countries like the United States, is that capitalism, and by extension monetary market economics and hierarchically stratified society, is ultimately unfit to serve the health needs of a given population. In fact, as demonstrably seen through business and world leaders' superficial environmental responses, our current paradigm is unfit to serve the health of anything. I posit that the only way humanity as a species can properly care for the health and well-being of other humans, fauna and ecosystems this Earth inhabits is to radically transform the way we collectively conduct ourselves as a society. More on that later. But what exactly is wrong with our current paradigm? Well, first, we need to understand it. Since ancient times, the dominant form of social organisation has been hierarchically stratified, authority-based society. The hierarchy in question has evolved throughout history: slave and owner, lord and serf, worker and capitalist. Respectively, the default form of administrative authority has also evolved: chieftain, emperor, monarch, and the modern representative state. Although the economies of such societies have evolved over time, there is one constant in this regard that has persisted throughout the ages: monetary market economics. In ancient and feudal times, money was a useful tool in society with legitimate value. The world's productive capacity was much lower than that of modern times, and so goods were scarcer and thus more precious. A few units of currency for a chicken and some grain might have been seen as a pretty good deal in such times. There were merchants, of course, but they were certainly not as big and influential as today's capitalists, nor was profit arguably the main motive. Not only was the Industrial Revolution the turning of the village into the city, the farm into the factory, it also marked the end of feudal times and the beginning of the age of capital. Absolute monarchy was succeeded by a representative quote-unquote democracy in colloquial terms, that is. But this form of governance has issues of its own, which are magnified today. The Industrial Revolution led to such an expansion in productive capacity that it allowed for the centralization of production. Rail infrastructure, for example, meant that business became less dependent on locale, and so could expand into other regions. Previously, it was very difficult for a business to increase its outreach, and this was a limiting factor on the size of the individual enterprise. Market competition was, for the lack of a better description, fairer. The increased ability for businesses to grow and expand meant that they could start to have a greater influence on everyday life, some even amassing enough worth to influence the representative state in their favour. The fact that this was and is able to happen is a fundamental problem with centralised governance. It can be and is often captured by external entities for such entities' own gain. Then there is the whole other aspect of how money states around the globe were established and upheld by aristocrats, with either little or only expedient concern for the interests of the masses. Today, there are many businesses that have grown so much that they are virtually able to buy elections. Some multinationals are even larger than small countries in net worth. Please excuse the crudely unrelated comparison, as we have gradually seen the separation of church and state in the past 2 centuries. In the past 40 or so years, we have seen the merging of state and capital. Today, we have not a proletariat and bourgeoisie, rather a popular class and an elite class, consisting of a muddy assortment of CEOs, investors, politicians and so on. The state and capital of today are not separate and opposing entities, as those of the Austrian school would believe, but rather in inseparable marriage, and perhaps could even be seen as a singular entity, an oligarchy, with the pursuit of wealth and power at all costs as its goal. The pursuit of profit, this stark accumulation of wealth, cannot in any way benefit the health and well-being of most people, nor our planet. Any attempt at doing what could be considered by most people as good incurs monetary costs, thus is the antithesis of profit making, so in today's economy it simply isn't done. So, with this kind of paradigm we have, what material conditions have been realised in the modern world? As of 2021, 26 people own as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the global population. Enterprise is more centralised and monopolised than ever, with just a few companies controlling the world's food and energy supply, media, tech and scientifics, finance, commerce, and so on. Many smaller businesses are simply unable to compete, and so these few companies dominate the economic landscape. When businesses become so large as to surpass the GDP of small countries, they not only corrupt and become unaccountable to governments, but also become unaccountable to their customer bases. They can and often do get away with murder, sometimes literally. Human rights abuses and abjectly precarious labour are commonly perpetuated in the third world by massive conglomerate entities. Resource-rich countries are exploited in the interests of capital for the pursuit of profitable gain. This is economic imperialism, and it's been happening for centuries, but has been exacerbated in modern times. Median pay has been, on the whole, stagnant in real terms since the late 70s. Although we're not quite back in the Gilded Age just yet, modern working conditions aren't anything to be amazed about, even in the relatively privileged first world. There are so many jobs that only exist because monetary markets exist. According to David Graeber, around 40% of all jobs are like this. Meanwhile, people have little time to recover, recollect, and enrich themselves as human beings, rather than as mere robots. The world's current ecological response is merely a fart in the wind. We're set to smash through the 1.5 degree rise over pre-industrial periods, the IPCC's recommended target. Ecosystems are collapsing. Extreme weather conditions are causing deaths to people and natural habitats. It's worth noting that 50% of all species have gone extinct since the 70s. Our economy is unfit to meet people's demands in a sustainable manner. We waste so many resources that could be fed back into the loop to be used again. Instead, planned obsolescence has become the industrial norm, rather than producing things that last and serve their purpose for an extended period of time. Many tech companies even go as far as to limit people's ability to repair their own stuff, which is a stark contrast to half a century ago, when people were even given schematics with their TV sets, for example. And all this is happening while our industry routinely outstrips its annual supply of resources. We are direly unprepared for the next industrial revolution, in which automation will be a key component. Automation should be liberating. It has the ability to replace most boring, repetitive, and precarious of jobs, but under this current system will likely be used to cut labour costs and thus increase profits. This puts fear in people that they are ever closer to losing their jobs to technological unemployment, and this has the potential to foment a regressive Luddite sentiment in people, which is counter to human progress. We are seeing unprecedented authoritarianism in this century. The police state is becoming ever more draconian, and authoritarianism is taking root in some parts of our cultures. People have become too willing to give up their freedoms for a false sense of security. And no, I'm not talking about mask wearing here. For the duration of the pandemic, it's a necessary measure. I'm talking about the willingness of authorities to infringe on people's privacy, to censor media, to suppress activism, among other notable things. I'm talking about the sentiment of hatred and retribution, as opposed to restitution and compassion that has taken root in society and culture. And if there's one thing that's demonstrably true amongst all this, is that the current socio-economic structure cannot adequately prepare for imminent crises. While places like Cuba and Vietnam certainly aren't perfect, they have handled their own outbreaks far better than the UK, America, and many places in Europe. And this has happened because they have adequately prepared for this type of disaster. By contrast, my country, the UK, has one of the highest COVID death rates in the world, and this is due to our government prioritising business over people's health, and also handicapping the healthcare system with a decade of historical privatisation. Not to mention the prior diversion of resources away from disaster prevention. We were caught napping. Now I can hazard a guess as to what you may be thinking. You seem pretty pessimistic about our current paradigm. What's your alternative? Again, let's look back at history. This certainly isn't the first time people have tried to rock the socio-economic boat. Amongst their many wrongdoings, the revolutions of the 20th century did have their merits. Soviet Russia went from a semi-agrarian backwater to launching a man to space in the span of 4 decades, and bar the 30s famine, was able to adequately feed, house, and provide for its people. Mao's China reduced poverty and massively increased the country's literacy rate. I will say that although these were great achievements, these systems are still less than ideal. Both these regimes' poor ecological management, human rights abuses, and authoritarianism left a lot to be desired. In revolutionary Catalonia, they got a lot closer to a truly egalitarian society. However, they were quickly subverted by the Spanish and the Soviets of the time. Aside from being outmaneuvered, the technology didn't exist then for this type of social organisation to be sustainable in the long term. Today, the Kurdish territory of Rojava seems promising, but they would likely suffer a similar fate in the future due to their material conditions. These societies I have talked about have been, in one way or another, socialist. While a socialist society would be vastly better for most people than what we currently have, in that it would improve people's material conditions, the simple criteria of collective ownership does not come close to being adequate in dealing with modern problems. Furthermore, the tendency for socialist regimes to enact draconian measures like the suppression of freedom of expression are troubling to me, and I imagine would be to most people watching this video also. So what am I actually proposing? For those of you who already follow my channel, you might have a gist of what I'm about to say. However, for the new viewer, I will entertain. It might seem silly to think of some better future. I can already hear the words caressing some minds. Dreamy, utopian, idealist, and the like. What not many realise is just how much is possible with our current technical and economic potential. Take automation for instance. The technology is there for machines to conduct virtually all menial and repetitive labour. Did you know that people feel between 37 to 50% of all jobs are essentially useless and provide little benefit to society? Such jobs are, however, meaningful to those with a lot of wealth. They exist either because monetary markets exist, or because those in high positions simply want them to exist. In describing this, the late anthropologist and activist David Graeber coined the term bullshit jobs in his essay of the same name. He stated, "A YouGov poll found that in the United Kingdom only 50% of those who had full-time jobs were entirely sure their job made any meaningful contribution to the world, and 37% were quite sure it did not." In the essay, Graeber gives some examples of these so-called bullshit jobs, namely corporate lawyers, receptionists, telemarketers, middle management, the list goes on. But you were talking about automation. What does this have to do with automation? Well, I want you to ponder on something. Not just give it a quick thought, but really try to ponder. What would a world without money be like? In the absence of money, these bullshit jobs Graeber describes have literally no reason to exist. In fact, I'm certain they won't. And when you combine this with automation taking care of the economic heavy lifting and doing all the boring but essential stuff relative to the world's population, there isn't really that much work left to be done. In a world without money, only a fraction of people would perhaps need to work at any given time. Imagine a world where you get up in the morning, not at 6 AM, but at 9 or 10, unless you're an early riser that is. You have every minute of the day to spend as you wish. Now some might argue that people would just be lazy, but I think most can agree that being lazy gets quite boring after a while. After all, while there wouldn't be jobs as such, or even the institution of employment, there would still be work to be done. In this imagined world, you can choose your own work. You might choose to be a chemist one year, an artist the next, and a tutor thereafter, limited by your education and expertise in each discipline, of course. You could choose your own schedule, and might not even have to work that long, lest you're dedicated or working on a significantly large or complex project. The reality is that this imagined world doesn't have to be so imaginary, as many may believe. The means of achieving a rudimentary form of what I have just illustrated already exist. In fact, the technical capacity to liberate humanity from toil and meet all basic needs has existed for decades. The limiting factor, at least going by traditional economics, is scarcity. However, even the notion of scarcity is just as erroneous as the necessity for most work, as I will deliberate further. Did you know that the agricultural and food industries produce enough food to feed 11 billion people, yet a third of it is wasted? Did you know that big tech churns out new revisions of devices year on year, while purposely making older models obsolete in order to increase profit? These are just a couple of examples of how the monetary market system creates what's known as artificial scarcity. Late-stage capitalism creates a highly inefficient mode of production, one where, if a good or resource has been extracted or produced but is deemed unprofitable, it simply gets wasted. The agricultural sector is infamous for crop burning in order to increase crop prices, for example. Within capitalism, this is known as the crisis of overproduction, when a good cannot sustain its price due to devaluation by overproduction. In a monetary society, this is a bad thing, because sellers cannot make as much money from their product, and thus economic contraction occurs. How insane is that producing enough for everyone is seen as a bad thing? In a moneyless society, more efficient production is always a good thing. But that doesn't just mean churning out more and more stuff in a shorter period of time. No, instead it means meeting demand with as few resources wasted as possible. Let's categorize the efficiency of this moneyless economy into efficient production and efficient consumption, and start with the former. In efficient production, things are produced from the most abundant resources possible, while still being fit for purpose, whether through replacing lithium batteries with sodium, making use of the abundant and renewable energy provided by the sun and tides, or by increasing farming density and saving resources in the process through opting for vertical farming and long-term cryonic storage of excess foodstuffs. And these are just the tip of the iceberg. As much as possible, raw materials would be reclaimed from obsolete products and recycled waste. When everything is seen as a resource, and thus is recycled, a highly efficient and sustainable closed-loop system, known as the circular economy, is achieved. Contrasting with the planned obsolescence of today, things would be built to last and be relevant for as long as possible, and where possible, goods would adopt modular design in order to minimize waste and give people the ability to customize goods to their liking. In addition, things would be produced only when there is demand. One of the drawbacks of our current system is that it involves a lot of guesswork as to what people want or need, and this can lead to highly wasteful production runs. To counter this, as part of efficient production, there could be a consumption feedback system in place, where everyone can decide what they want or need, and only those things are produced for only those people. Big data has come a long way in modern times, and is a tool that could be implemented in this way. This isn't even mentioning the blockchain, which is another powerful tool that could be used for economic management. Production when needed is often easier to accomplish with additive manufacturing and CNC technology more generally. Now let's discuss what is meant by efficient consumption. A bottleneck of the current system, in its ability to make goods and services available to people, is the institution of property ownership, which is also a contributor to artificial scarcity. If we were to do away with this institution, it would open up a lot of possibilities and could potentially resolve some scarcities automatically. Instead, I and other advocates of what I am describing favour a system of access over ownership. A truncated definition might simply be the absence of property ownership, and that's sort of what it boils down to. However, this definition ignores the consequences of such an arrangement. In summary, in access over ownership, or perhaps in more understandable terms, common simultaneous ownership, anyone has access to any good, service, or resource at any given time, and in the context of a moneyless economy would also mean people would have access to these things without the need for money, debt, trade, or employment. Now, I might feel a question coming. Without money, how do you limit people's consumption? Well, the simple answer is you don't. Contrary to what seems like popular belief, once humans have satisfied the bottom 4 tiers of Maslow's hierarchy, we tend to be fairly content. I have another video explaining Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which you can go and check out on my channel. With that out of the way, let's continue. Access over ownership is more efficient than property relations because more people can make use of a particular good, thus enjoying the utility of that good without owning one of their own, which means another unit of that good doesn't need to be produced, saving resources. A common example I give in this regard is the bicycle. Today, one person might own a bicycle but only use it for their daily commute, so a maximum of about 2 hours a day is a reasonable estimate. The problem with this is that the bike is being left unused when its owner isn't riding it. This means almost a whole day of unused utility is wasted. Within a system of access, instead of one person owning a bicycle, there could be bicycles scattered across a community for people to use when they need to. This increases the likelihood of less bikes getting used by more people at different times of the day, thus making more efficient use of that good's utility. This could be applied to anything, with slight variations depending on context. For example, while homes would follow the same system of access, I'm not advocating that anyone should just be able to barge into a home you're currently occupying. Discussion about housing is for a separate installment. But I do think there is a way that most goods and aspects of life can be tailored to access over ownership, which not only makes for an efficient and thus sustainable consumption pattern, but also allows more people to enjoy the means of life and fulfillment. And this is all tied together through the effective and intelligent management of resources through cybernetic means in modern times, so that extraction, production, and distribution maintain utmost efficiency and sustainability. In such a context, where the primary goal of the economy is not to facilitate monetary gain through a market, but instead to maximize an abundant and sustainable supply of resources to benefit all, we would no longer have a monetary market economy. In such a context, we would have a resource-based economy. But that's just part of the puzzle. In order to function as a civilization, we need not just an efficient and sustainable economy, but a society that is socially sustainable and looks after all, and a culture of community, trust, freedom, and inclusion. To this end, I propose a radical shift in our social structure and value systems. I would describe our contemporary society and culture as hyper-individualist, egoist, unforgiving to anything or anyone seen as inferior. Current work schedules give people little time to socialise, as if socialisation itself hasn't been resigned to some digital apparitions of ourselves. The current social climate is one of isolation, alienation, separation, and loneliness. The strong communal infrastructure and fabric that was once commonly found among primitive and even some feudal societies has been replaced by a sterile and materialistic individualism that has been perfected for profit-making and hampering collective action and support. There are many contributions to this scenario, one of which being the galvanised policing presence that suppresses protest and watches our every move, both online and in the real world. Then there is the question of community design itself. With the way our city systems are designed, there is little in terms of what I would call social infrastructure. Today's landscapes are filled with chain shops, restaurants, and activities that are hidden behind a paywall. Our cities are not designed for socialization, but for the circulation of currency. Furthermore, in spite of attempts to increase so-called green space in many European cities, urban populations are still, to theirs and various ecosystems' detriment, mainly detached from nature and the natural world. Human beings are strongest when we have good, sustained social connections. It's partly how we became so intelligent as a species, and how we were able to survive through times of crisis. Additionally, through social efforts, we have been able to advance ourselves to a degree of technical progress unseen in any primate before us. Socialization, with the unique exception of the current outbreak, has even had a significant positive effect on our immune system, with loners often dying earlier and becoming sick more easily. When it comes to our connection to the natural world, it has been shown that urban populations suffer more depression, anxiety, asthma, and other conditions. In contrast, immersion in the natural environment has been linked to better overall physical and mental well-being. Moreover, being connected to nature allows people to empathize with it and with all the fauna that inhabit the wilds. In fact, in many ways, we can take inspiration from nature for the design of our communities for the benefit of both nature and humanity. It can also be the case that these design communities have a symbiotic relationship with the ecosphere. Hereafter, I will explain my proposal for what I term community ecology. This is ultimately the system I propose for the next stage of our social evolution as a species. There are four main aspects of this system: the economic, the interpersonal, the communal, and the systemic. Resource-based economics, supported by robust resource management systems and efficient production and consumption patterns, is the economic backbone of this structure. It deals with most of the heavy lifting when it comes to resource calculation, distribution, etc. On a smaller scale though, such as interactions between individuals or cooperative enterprises, such organisations might opt for something different. On the interpersonal level, there are many things that would be different in a community ecology. Gift economics is a suitable alternative to market exchange that also has the capability of propagating social as well as economic relationships, something that is more difficult with monetary markets. Ideas would be fully open source and freely available for anyone to contribute to and modify. A so-called free market of ideas might form, where individuals and enterprises share their ideas and collaborate. The vehicle for this type of collaboration, again propagated through gift economics, is the collaborative commons. I personally refer to a singular enterprise within this common economic collage as a commons cooperative. On an interpersonal level also, with the absence of money, greater community infrastructure, and more, people might have greater trust for one another and could perhaps form more cohesive relationships. Not only does this make for safer communities overall, but building social bonds would also be far easier in such a scenario. The communal aspect of community ecology is perhaps the part that most prominently intersects social and ecological concern. Instead of urban sprawl, like we have today, each community would have a carrying capacity, arrived at by statistical calculation and communal consensus. City systems would also appear vastly different. What has become of particular interest to RBE advocates is the idea of designing cities radially rather than in a grid formation. Self-evidently, nature loves efficiency. The most common shapes in nature are variations of the circle and hexagon, as we see in many flowering plants and the isometric shape of tree trunks, and within the hives of bees, and even the hexagon rings of organic molecules. The hexagon is both the strongest shape and the one that has the most efficient packing order. The circle is the shape with the largest surface area. It can fit the most stuff in it. Taking these into account in city design will lead to cities that are more efficient, save space, and prevent sprawl. When combined with rewilding efforts and localized city-integrated production, we can make our communities sustainable and in balance with the natural world. In order to build a sense of community and make the formation of social relations easier, we will need to create environments that are conducive to socialization and the sharing of ideas and concepts. This can be achieved through things like, but not limited to, communal kitchens, studios, makerspaces, well-sourced social clubs and support groups, and things of that nature. We can collectively refer to these as social infrastructure. Nature has often inspired us in our creations. In a similar way to how increased biodiversity is good for the health of an ecosystem, cultural diversity, spearheaded by freedom of expression, can also benefit the wellness of the community. Additionally, there are people with specific needs that cannot be fulfilled in a generalized one-size-fits-all society. In light of this, a factor that should be taken into community design is the need for autonomous enclaves within each community that allow people with specific needs, interests, or cultural persuasions to congregate, live, work, and socialize with similar individuals or groups. A community of cultures, as I referred to it in one of my previous installments. I must emphasize that the right of positive and negative liberties is paramount to this cultural diversity. Without one doing harm unto others, one must be free to do as they wish, and they must be free from the tyranny of imposed authority. I cannot think of a social structure that values people's freedoms more than one that is almost completely egalitarian. On a systemic level, perhaps the aspect of community ecology that mostly relates to our relationship with other ecosystems, there could be multiple measures we take as a civilization to ensure we keep within our ecological means and indeed benefit the ecology around us. One such thing is approaching problems in a holistic, integrated and passive manner, as opposed to simply addressing the symptoms of a problem through temporary or individual solutions. We want to avoid so-called solutionism that exists today. I'll give an example: sun protection. The titanium dioxide in sunscreen is considered an oceanic pollutant, and the effectiveness of sunscreen itself relies on individuals applying it correctly. Thus, the results of this solution are suboptimal. A more permanent solution would be to ensure that communities have adequate shade, either through artificial shade or through increased tree coverage. This achieves the aim of providing sun protection for members of a community while also cutting resource costs, and thus improving production efficiency and also reducing pollution and runoff. Speaking of increased tree coverage, in order to improve the well-being of citizens and protect and even enhance biodiversity, a philosophy of biophilic design could be employed. This would make city systems more habitable for various species of wildlife and would allow citizens to enjoy the benefit of being immersed in a more organic environment. In such a scenario, as opposed to contemporary times, this might lead to us being more connected with the animal kingdom. Perhaps we would even see ourselves then not as separate from all other species, but indeed a piece of the ecological puzzle. I could go on and iterate more examples, but I don't want to further detract from the central focus of this installment. All this about a free, equitable and sustainable society sounds great, but how can we realistically achieve such a thing? Well, we certainly cannot just sit by and count on our supposedly elected officials. History has shown governments to be ineffective at spearheading change for popular benefit. Businesses are capable of influencing the world a great deal, but are often too preoccupied with increasing profits, or are often cash-strapped in the case of social enterprises and NGOs. It is tempting for myself and some other advocates to start a business for the sake of using the profits for the advancement and development of our movement and systemic transition. And this is something I'll cautiously agree with. However, it cannot be our only route to the initiation of change. In fact, for many, such a feat is simply not feasible with their current material conditions. What we firstly need to do, collectively as a movement, is prove that people can live and thrive outside of capitalist society. And to do this, we need to firstly build the preliminary infrastructure for transition from within our homes and communities. This can mean people growing their own food and sharing it with others in a distributed network of moneyless sharing. It can mean making more stuff without the use of money. You'd be surprised just how many raw materials can be extracted, recovered, and used without using a single penny, startup costs aside. The wealth of information accessible to most via the web and micro-manufacturing techniques, namely various CNC technologies, make this more possible today than ever. It could mean creating a framework that demonstrates how education and tutoring can be approached in a radically different manner. Along with this, aggressively but diplomatically advocating the ideas I've discussed to those interested will help this movement approach critical mass at an expedited rate. This breaking away from the current system is twofold. If enough people engage in these self-sufficient, distributed networks of moneyless sharing, not only could such a capitalist consumption exodus lead to the progressive dysfunction of the capitalist marketplace, it could also germinate the seeds of change and spark the beginning of the transition into a new and better world, with it all starting within the shell of the old. Once developed enough, members of this movement could begin to congregate and pool resources into forming official communities, taking the pre-established infrastructure and making it independent of contemporary societal influence. As a proof of concept that alternative systems and ways of life are not only possible, but they even surpass the dominant capitalist hegemony across a litany of metrics. Of course, there will be pushback, resistance from those with power and influence. With this in mind, we must act strategically, anticipating establishment moves and planning accordingly. I will cover this topic in due time. Of course, as the transition progresses, we will need to make greater provisions, such as setting up our own healthcare system. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, for we've only really just begun. For now, we need to focus on what we can do, what forms of direct action we can organise in order to get the ball rolling. Because if we don't act now, if we as community ecology or RBE advocates, and indeed progressives of all kinds, just become overly immersed in theory and just let the tides take us, we'll get nowhere, and we'll likely face an ugly world where all that we cherish, even the basic things, are seen as a long forgotten privilege. And for what? A few extra zeros in an offshore account? Simply put, we can't let this happen. A better world is indeed possible. The means of reaching it are right there. They're just currently behind monetary barriers. So, to avoid a capitalistic dystopia, to ensure the survival and indeed make possible the thriving of humanity and our planet, let's do something about it, together. I've been AJ, and I wish you a belated welcome to 2021 on my channel. Stay tuned, and I'll catch you all next time. Thanks for watching.